Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. If you feel fear, you should like and subscribe this channel. So, let's go. The firewood was running low again. I hadn't noticed until I tried to stoke the fire that morning and realized the last few logs sat stacked beside the hearth, shrinking with every passing night. Winter hadn't arrived yet, but the evenings had begun biting with an early chill, creeping through the cracks of my old cabin like invisible fingers. Living alone on the edge of the forest had its perks: peace, quiet, and a kind of solitude most people never experienced. But it also meant I had no one else to rely on. If I wanted firewood, I had to get it myself. By the time I grabbed my axe and stepped outside, the afternoon sun had already begun its slow descent. The sky was a fading blue, tinged with the soft gold of approaching dusk. I didn't think much of it. I had plenty of time before dark. The forest greeted me the way it always did. Tall, ancient trees stretching their limbs toward the heavens, their gnarled roots twisting through the undergrowth like veins. The air smelled damp, rich with the scent of earth and decaying leaves. A faint breeze whispered through the branches, carrying the familiar rustling of unseen creatures moving through the foliage. But something felt different. I paused at the edge of the trees, gripping the axe tighter. The silence was heavier than usual. The birds, which normally chirped in a chorus of evening songs, had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I shook off the unease. It's just my imagination. With a deep breath, I stepped into the woods. The crunch of dead leaves and twigs beneath my boots echoed louder than it should have. Every step felt deliberate, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I had been in these woods hundreds of times before, knew the trails like the back of my hand. And yet, as I walked deeper, a strange sensation prickled at my spine, like I was intruding on something, or something was waiting. I tried to focus on the task at hand, scanning the ground for fallen branches. The axe was only for emergencies. Splitting wood, or, on rare occasions, fending off the occasional stubborn animal that wandered too close. So far, I had never needed it for the latter. I bent down, picking up a decent-sized log. As I straightened, my eyes flickered up, and I saw it. At first, my brain refused to understand what I was looking at. A figure, standing between the trees, partially obscured by the shifting shadows. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't moving, but it wasn't still either. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Its limbs were too long, its body stretched thin like something that had been pulled apart but hadn't quite broken. Its skin, if it had skin, was the color of tree bark, blending too well with the surrounding woods. Its fingers hung low, nearly touching the ground, and though it had no visible eyes, I felt it watching me. The weight of its gaze was suffocating, pressing down on my chest like a physical force. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. My legs refused to move, as if the forest itself had wrapped its roots around my ankles, anchoring me in place. A second passed, then another. The figure didn't move. Neither did. A gust of wind swept through the trees, rustling the leaves, breaking the unbearable stillness. The moment shattered like glass, and I sucked in a breath, my body finally remembering how to function. I took a slow, careful step back. The figure remained, unmoving, unbothered, a trick of the light, a fallen tree at an odd angle. My mind desperately searched for a logical explanation, but none came. I turned away, pulse hammering in my ears. Get the wood, get back to the cabin. Do not look back. Forcing my hands to remain steady, I gathered what I could. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of a leaf, sent fresh jolts of fear through me. The weight of that unseen gaze never left. Finally, with my arms full of wood, I started back. The path felt longer than before, The trees taller, their shadows stretching like grasping hands. The figure remained out of sight, but I knew it was still there, watching, waiting. And though I made it back to my cabin before nightfall, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the forest wasn't just the forest anymore, that I hadn't left alone. The moment I stepped back inside my cabin, I bolted the door shut and pressed my back against it, woodpile still clutched in my arms. My breath came fast and shallow, my heartbeat a relentless drum in my ears. I forced myself to move, to act like nothing was wrong. Dropping the firewood into its designated corner, I crouched near the hearth and fed a few logs to the dying flames. The fire crackled to life, warm and reassuring, and yet I still felt cold. I tried to shake the feeling, convincing myself it was just lingering unease. I'd seen something in the forest, that was certain, but maybe it had been nothing more than an odd tree or a play of light and shadow. I wanted to believe that, but a deeper part of me knew better. Nightfall came quickly, swallowing the forest in darkness. My cabin was small, one large room with a loft above, and the fire's glow cast flickering shadows against the wooden walls. I sat at my table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, staring at the window across from me. It was open when I left. Now it was closed. I knew for a fact I hadn't shut it. A slow, creeping dread curled in my stomach. I stood and walked to the window, peering through the glass into the night beyond. The forest loomed, black and endless, its shapes shifting in the dim moonlight, and then a movement, a dark shape, standing just beyond the tree line. It wasn't as far as before. The figure was closer now. I stumbled back from the window, heart slamming against my ribs. My mind screamed at me to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but I couldn't. It stood perfectly still, just like before, but something had changed. It was facing me now. I don't know how I could tell. It had no discernible eyes, no face at all, just a vague, elongated shape blending too well into the surrounding trees. But I felt it staring. The fire crackled, snapping me back to my senses. My breath came in shaky gasps. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to think logically. Maybe it was a trick of the mind. Maybe my own fear was warping the darkness into something sinister. Maybe. But as I stepped away from the window, I heard it, a branch snapping, close. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body tightening. I strained to listen, my ears filled with the sound of my own breathing. Another snap, then silence. It was moving. I grabbed my axe from where I had left it by the door, my fingers wrapping tightly around the worn handle. The weight of it felt reassuring, solid. If someone, something, was out there, I wasn't going to sit and wait for it to come knocking. The next few hours dragged by in suffocating silence. I didn't sleep. I barely moved. I kept the fire burning bright, as if the light could keep whatever was outside at bay. But I never heard anything else, and that was worse, because the silence didn't mean it was gone. It meant it was waiting. I must have dozed off at some point, because when I opened my eyes, the fire had burned low, and the first hints of dawn peeked through the window. Cautiously, I stood and approached the door. My hand hovered over the latch, my breath held tight in my chest. Slowly, I unbolted it, and cracked it open just enough to peer outside. The forest stood still, unmoved, but then I saw them. The footprints. They weren't mine. They were too long, too deep, leading from the tree line straight to my cabin. And then they stopped. Right outside my window, right where it had been watching me. I slammed the door shut, locking it tight. My mind raced, grasping for any explanation. That wasn't the one I feared most, but there was no denying it now. It wasn't just some trick of the light. It wasn't my imagination. It had been here, watching, waiting. And the worst part, It knew where I lived. I didn't leave the cabin for the rest of the morning. Instead, I sat at the table, staring at the door, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. The footprints outside my window weren't human. They were too large, too deep, like something impossibly tall and heavy had stood just outside watching, and it hadn't left any footprints leading away. That detail stuck with me the most. The tracks led to my cabin, but not away from it, like it had just vanished. I clenched my hands into fists, my pulse still unsteady. My thoughts raced through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. I wasn't a superstitious person. I had lived alone in these woods for years, spent countless nights listening to the howls of wolves, the distant hoots of owls, the wind whispering through the trees. I had never been afraid before. But now I felt like an intruder. In my own home, I forced myself to move. I needed to do something, anything, to regain a sense of normalcy. Stepping cautiously to the window, I pulled the curtain back. The forest remained as still as ever, drenched in the pale morning light. Nothing stirred. No dark figure stood between the trees. And yet I knew it was still out there. The uneasy silence hadn't lifted. Grabbing my axe, I braced myself and unbolted the door. The cold morning air rushed in as I stepped outside, my breath forming thin clouds. The footprints were still there, pressed deep into the damp earth. I crouched beside them, inspecting the size, the depth. They were inhuman. The impression suggested something with long, narrow feet and claw-like toes, the kind that would belong to a creature built for moving through the trees. I followed the tracks back toward the tree line, my grip tightening around the axe handle. As I reached the edge of the woods, my breath caught in my throat. The ground beyond the first row of trees was untouched. No signs of movement, no broken branches, no trail leading deeper. It was as if whatever had come to my cabin had simply ceased to exist the moment it left my sight. A sharp chill crept up my spine. I turned back to the cabin, forcing myself to keep my steps slow and even. If I ran, it would feel too much like I was being chased. Back inside, I locked the door again and leaned against it, exhaling shakily. My mind screamed at me to pack my things and leave, to get as far away from these woods as possible. But where would I go? My entire life was here. My home, my work, everything I had built for myself. I couldn't just leave. But I couldn't ignore this either. The rest of the day passed in a fog of unease. I barely ate, barely moved. Every so often I found myself staring at the window, waiting to see something lurking in the distance. But nothing came. By nightfall, exhaustion had settled into my bones, but I refused to sleep. Instead, I sat by the fire, axe resting beside me, my ears straining for any sound beyond the crackling flames. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. It sounded normal, but the forest had a way of playing tricks, of making things seem safe when they weren't. Hours passed. My eyelids grew heavy, and then a sound. Not loud, not sudden, just a soft, deliberate tap, like fingers brushing against the wood of the cabin. I sat up, my muscles locking in place. My eyes darted toward the window. The fire's glow barely reached it, but I could make out the faintest shift in the shadows beyond the glass. Something was out there. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Another tap. Soft. Slow. Not a knock. Not an attempt to enter. Just a touch. Like it was reminding me it was still here. Still watching. I gripped my axe tighter, willing myself not to react. If I acknowledged it, if I let it know, I was afraid. What then? The tapping stopped. The wind howled through the trees. The fire crackled. And then, nothing. The weight of the unseen presence lifted, just slightly, like it had made its point, like it had decided I wasn't worth its time. Didn't sleep that night. I didn't close my eyes once. By morning, the forest felt lighter. Not safe, not normal, but as if something had shifted. The silence wasn't as suffocating. The birds had even returned, their songs tentative, cautious. I stepped outside, gripping, my axe scanning the tree line. The footprints were gone, not covered by fresh dirt or washed away by rain, just gone. Like nothing had ever been there. Like it had never happened. But I knew better. I knew it had been real, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would never go into the woods alone again. Not for firewood. Not for anything. Because whatever it was, it hadn't left. It had simply lost interest. For now. I've always been drawn to the quiet of the forest, the deep green of the trees, the stillness that seems to calm my restless mind. There's nothing quite like it. So, when I found an old trailhead marked with a faded sign that led deep into the pines, I couldn't resist. It was early evening when I began the hike, the sun still casting its warm light through the branches. I was alone, with only the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt path. The woods were beautiful, peaceful, even. The occasional bird call, the rustle of leaves, and the soft wind were the only sounds that kept me company. I thought I knew this trail well. I'd heard stories from locals about its beauty, its calm. But the deeper I went, the quieter it became. The birds had stopped singing, and the wind had died down. The silence wrapped around me like a thick blanket. I stopped to catch my breath, scanning my surroundings. The pines towered above me, their needles swaying gently, but there was an odd stillness to the air. It was too quiet. A feeling began to creep over me, an uncomfortable sense that I was being watched. I shrugged it off. Probably just the isolation, I thought. I'd been hiking alone many times before. Still, something about this place felt off. I walked for another hour, each step taking me further into the dense forest. The trail narrowed, the trees closing in around me. The path was almost completely obscured by fallen needles, but I kept going, trusting my sense of direction. Then I heard it, a soft whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like a breath of wind passing through the trees. But it was there, and it wasn't the wind. My heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. Nothing. Just the rustling of leaves and the occasional creak of branches. I took a few more steps, my unease growing. Another whisper, this time closer. My pulse quickened. I spun around, but the path was empty. There was no one. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. But the words felt hollow in the stillness. The whisper came again. This time, it was clearer. "Go back." My breath hitched in my throat. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but it wasn't human. It sounded distant, as if it was coming from behind the trees or from beneath the ground. My stomach churned. I turned, trying to find the trail I had come from, but everything around me looked the same. The trees were taller, more twisted, and the path had disappeared, swallowed up by the underbrush. I had no idea where I was anymore. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Leave. You're not wanted here." I backed away, my heart pounding. I felt like the very forest was alive, closing in around me. Panic set in. I ran. The trees seemed to blur as I sprinted, but no matter how fast I moved, the trail didn't reappear. The whispers followed me, echoing from every direction. The soft, eerie voice seemed to come from the shadows themselves. "Turn around," the voice hissed. I froze, my breath coming in short gasps. Something in the back of my mind screamed at me to look, but I didn't. I couldn't. Whatever was behind me wasn't human. My feet carried me forward, and finally, after what felt like hours of running, I stumbled into a clearing. The forest was silent again. The whispers had stopped. I stood there, gasping for air, my legs trembling beneath. Me. The clearing was empty. No trees, no shadows, just wide open space. But as I looked around, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the far edge of the clearing, standing among the trees, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its features indistinct in the dim light. But what struck me most was its posture. Unnatural, twisted, its head tilted at an impossible angle, staring directly at me. I froze, too terrified to move. The figure didn't move. It just stared. A cold wind swept through the clearing, and with it came the whispers again, now louder than ever. Go. I didn't need any more encouragement. I turned and bolted, not stopping until I burst through the tree line and back, onto the main trail. The sun had nearly set, and the forest was once again alive with sounds. Birds, insects, the rustling of leaves. But I couldn't shake the image of the figure in the clearing, its hollow stare burning into my mind. I've never gone back to those woods. I don't know what I saw, or who, or what was whispering to me from the trees. But I know one thing for sure. Some places are best left undisturbed. I didn't expect the woods to feel so alive. I'd been hiking for hours, my backpack heavy with supplies, my boots crunching on the forest floor. It was supposed to be a peaceful, solitary trip to escape the hustle of city life. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. But something was different today. The air was unnaturally still, and the deeper I ventured, the more I felt an unsettling presence. The sun was low, casting long, creeping shadows between the trees. My map indicated a small clearing just ahead, the perfect spot to set up camp for the night. I had a tent and a fire starter, so it would be a simple night of solitude under the stars. I pushed forward. As I entered the clearing, something caught my eye. It was a large tree, twisted and gnarled, its bark darkened with age. There was something oddly symmetrical about it, almost like it had been shaped deliberately. I felt a chill run down my spine. I shrugged it off, setting up my tent in the center of the clearing. The trees around me stood tall and thick, their branches forming a sort of natural barrier. The quiet was oppressive now. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. The night fell quickly, and I managed to get a small fire going. The crackling flames pushed back the dark for a while, but the eerie silence persisted. I glanced around, feeling as if something was watching me. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the underbrush made my heart race, but when I looked, there was nothing. I decided to try and relax. I pulled out a book, but the words seemed to blur on the page. My mind kept drifting, drawn to the shadows just beyond the firelight. It was then that I saw it. A figure standing between the trees, just out of the corner of my eye. I froze. I could barely make out the shape of a person, tall and still. My heart pounded in my chest. I blinked and looked again. It was gone. I shook, my head, forcing myself to focus. I was just tired, I told myself. The forest can play tricks on you. I took a deep breath and tried to go back to my book, but the unease settled in like a weight. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Couldn't shake it, no matter how I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I stood up, hoping the movement would calm my nerves. The fire flickered, casting odd shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost like breathing. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, rhythmic, as if someone was standing just out of sight, breathing in time with my own. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness. Nothing. Then, as if on cue, the figure appeared again, just beyond the firelight. It wasn't moving, just standing perfectly still, its shape more defined now. I could see it clearly, but it was wrong. The figure wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, too thin, its head tilted at an odd angle as if it were studying me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I took a step back, but my foot caught on something. A root, maybe. I stumbled, landing awkwardly on the ground. The figure remained motionless, watching. The fire flickered again, and when the light caught the figure's face, I felt my stomach lurch. Its eyes were wide and hollow, dark pits staring back at me. There was no face, no expression, just the emptiness of those eyes. I couldn't look away. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, vanishing into the shadows. I couldn't breathe. My pulse raced as I scrambled to my feet, hands trembling. The figure was gone, but the silence returned, heavier now. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run, but I couldn't make my legs move. My mind was frozen in place. I grabbed my things in a frantic rush, stumbling as I tried to pack away my tent. The fear was like ice in my veins, pushing me forward. I turned to look behind me, half expecting to see the figure standing there, waiting. Nothing. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest, the trees thinning as I neared the trailhead. I didn't turn around once. When I finally emerged onto the dirt road, I collapsed, gasping for air. The forest behind me was still, peaceful even, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt. And as I sat there, staring into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes were still watching me. I love the forest. It's always been my escape from the busy world, the place where I can clear my mind and feel at peace. That's why I decided to take a solo hike last weekend, far from the main trails, hoping for some quiet time in nature. The day was overcast when I set off, the air cool but not cold. The forest was dense, the trees towering high above me, their thick leaves filtering out the sunlight. The ground was soft underfoot, the scent of damp earth and pine filling the air. Everything felt perfect. I followed a narrow trail that snaked through the trees. It wasn't a well-maintained path, but it seemed to be leading somewhere. As I walked, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves surrounded me, a constant hum of life. The further I went, though, the quieter it became. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but soon, the forest felt unnatural. The silence was heavy, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. After a while, I came across a fork in the trail. One path continued straight ahead, and the other veered left, barely visible through a thicket of underbrush. The left path looked less traveled, but something about it intrigued me. Without thinking, I turned onto it. The trees grew thicker here, their branches intertwining, blocking out more and more light. The air felt colder, the shadows deeper. It didn't seem right, but I convinced myself it was just a normal part of hiking through denser parts of the forest. As I continued, the trail became less defined, and soon I was walking through thick brush, ducking under low-hanging branches. I wasn't sure where I was anymore, but I was determined to keep going. Then I noticed something strange. The path seemed to be narrowing. I had to push my way through the undergrowth, and it was getting harder to move. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw something. A clearing, faintly visible through the trees. I pushed through the last bit of brush and stepped into the open space. The clearing was small, surrounded by tall, old trees that seemed to have been there for centuries. In the center of the clearing stood a rock, smooth and round, almost like a natural pedestal. The air here felt still, oppressive. I took a few steps into the clearing, and that's when I heard it. A faint whisper, like a voice, carried on. The wind. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The voice was distant, barely audible, but it was unmistakably there. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel it. Something was off. I turned around, ready to leave, but something caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see the shape of a person. They were just standing there, motionless. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. The figure didn't move. I took a step back, then another. The figure still didn't move. It was as if it was waiting for me to leave, or maybe to approach. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and run, but I didn't. Instead, I slowly started to walk toward the figure. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to grow heavier, like it was pressing against me. The whispering sound grew louder, but now it felt like it was coming from all around me, not just the figure. My head spun, and I felt dizzy. I stopped just a few feet from the figure. It was now standing beneath a tall tree, its branches hanging low. The figure was still obscured in shadows, but I felt it was watching me, waiting. I tried to make out its face, but there was nothing, just an empty space where a face should have been. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The forest fell into a deep, unnatural silence. My heart raced. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the figure. I turned, running as fast as I could, pushing through the thick brush, my breath ragged in my chest. I didn't stop until I was back on the main trail, the trees opening up around me, the sounds of the forest slowly returning. The rest of the hike back was a blur. My mind raced, my thoughts scattered. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the lingering sensation of something following me, though I never saw it again. When I finally made it back to my car, the sun had set, casting long shadows over the parking lot. I felt a strange sense of relief, but also an overwhelming sense of dread. I knew I would never walk that path again. The next day, I looked up the trail on a map. The path I had taken wasn't marked. No one I spoke to had ever heard of it. But I knew one thing for sure. The forest had a secret, and I'd been foolish enough to wander too close to it. It was supposed to be a simple hike, just me, my backpack, and the dense forest I knew so well. I'd been on the trail hundreds of times before, but that day, something felt different. I left early, before the sun had fully risen, the air crisp, with morning coolness. The forest was quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind blew gently through the trees. The path, familiar and winding, stretched ahead of me, with the tall pines standing like silent sentinels. I settled into a steady pace, enjoying the solitude. But as the hours passed, the forest seemed to change. The light didn't feel the same. It wasn't the golden warmth of a typical morning. It was colder, harsher, as though the sun's rays were being blocked by something unseen. I brushed it off. The forest often played tricks on the mind. I came to a fork in the trail. Something I didn't remember being there. One path led deeper into the trees, the other toward a small clearing. It wasn't the way I'd planned to go, but something about the fork intrigued me. Maybe it was the stillness, or the way the air seemed to hum faintly around the path to the right. Either way, I chose it. I followed the new trail, the ground soft beneath my boots, the forest around me growing thicker. The trees seemed to crowd closer, their trunks dark and twisted. The silence was absolute. No birds, no rustling animals, not even the wind. It wasn't long before I noticed a change in the trees. They were different now. Older, with gnarled branches that looked as if they had twisted and bent into unnatural shapes. My instincts told me to turn back, but I pushed the thought away. I was just being paranoid. Then I heard it. A voice. Quiet at first, like a whisper carried on the breeze, but then clearer, louder. My name. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it, but it was unmistakable. Come closer. the voice called. Turned in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there, just the thick wall of trees. The hairs on my arms prickled, but I told myself it was just the wind, just my mind playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I pushed forward, the strange voice still echoing in my mind. I reached a clearing, a wide, flat space where the trees parted like the opening of a stage. At the center of the clearing stood an old stone well. It looked ancient, covered in moss and vines, as if it had been there for centuries. I approached cautiously, the air growing colder as I neared the well. The stone felt cold to the touch when I ran my fingers along its surface. I peered down into the well, expecting to see darkness. But instead, there was a faint light at the bottom. It was dim, but it was there, flickering like a candle. I stepped back, unsure of what to make of it. Then, the voice came again, closer this time. Look inside. I turned, but no one was there. My heart raced, my breath quickening. The urge to flee surged through me, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the forest itself had rooted me to the spot. The voice, now almost a whisper, spoke again. "You're the last one." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I took a step back, but something stopped me. A deep, primal feeling that I couldn't ignore. Something wasn't right. The clearing was wrong, the well wrong. It felt as if I wasn't meant to be here. And that's when I saw it. In the reflection of the well, I saw a figure standing behind me, just outside the circle of trees. The figure was tall, its shape dark against the dim light, but there was something distinctly unnatural about it. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. My heart hammered in my chest, but I didn't dare turn around. The figure was gone the moment I blinked, but the air felt thicker now, more oppressive. Without thinking, I bolted. I turned and ran, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I pushed through the underbrush. The trees seemed to close in on me, and the path I had come from was no longer visible. I was lost, disoriented, but I didn't dare slow down. The voice came again, echoing through the forest, the words clearer now. "Stay with us." I pushed harder, my legs aching, my chest tight. I could hear footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, keeping pace with my frantic flight. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled out of the woods. The trees opened up, and I found myself on a familiar trail, the one I had first set out on. The sunlight had returned, the forest calm, and ordinary again. I didn't look back. I don't know what I saw in that forest or who or what was calling to me. But I know one thing for sure. I never want to find out again. I've always been fond of hiking. A little escape into the woods to clear my mind was exactly what I needed after a stressful week. This time, I decided to hike alone. The forest was peaceful, the kind of place where the trees seem to whisper, and the silence is almost comforting. I set off down a familiar trail, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows over the ground. The wind had died down, and the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were replaced with an eerie stillness. I felt it then. Something was off. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my nerves acting up. As I trekked deeper into the forest, the path started to narrow. The trees grew thicker, their branches interlocking overhead, blocking out much of the fading light. I should have turned around then, but my curiosity pushed me forward. The trail ahead was narrow and twisted, but I couldn't resist. I must have walked for hours, lost in thought before I realized it was completely dark. The dense canopy above made it hard to see anything. I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on, its beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. That's when I heard it. A soft, crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze. I turned, off the flashlight, listening. Nothing. I took a deep breath, convincing myself it was just an animal or the wind. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I switched the light back on and scanned the area around me. Nothing. No animal, no movement. My pulse quickened. I decided to head back, but as I turned, I saw something strange. A figure stood about 50 feet away, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, standing perfectly still. My heart raced. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I stepped forward cautiously, the beam of my flashlight bouncing across the forest floor. The figure didn't move. It wasn't even breathing, it seemed. I took another step. The figure finally shifted, but only slightly. I stopped in my tracks. There was something unsettling about the way it moved. Too slow, too deliberate. Then the figure spoke, its voice barely a whisper carried by the wind. "Leave." It wasn't a request, it was an order. I froze, fear gripping me. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. Instead, I just stood there, my mind racing for any explanation. Was it another hiker? Someone lost, like me? But no, this figure felt wrong. The figure began to move toward me. I took a step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I couldn't make out any details. No face, no clothes, just an inky silhouette against the trees. "Please, just leave," it said again, and this time its voice seemed closer. I didn't wait for it to speak again. I turned and bolted, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted down the trail. The air around me felt thicker, heavier, as if the forest itself was closing in. I didn't stop running, not until I saw the familiar outline of the trailhead in the distance. The figure was gone, but the air was still thick with tension. My lungs burned, and my heart raced in a frantic rhythm. I stumbled out of the forest, gasping for breath. The sun had long since set, but the night felt oppressive. I looked back, half expecting to see the figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But there was nothing. I didn't want to go back into those woods. The peacefulness I had once found in the forest had been replaced by something dark, something watching. I promised myself I'd never come back, and yet, every time I close my eyes, I hear that voice again. Leave. The mist rolled in fast. Jake and Olivia were halfway through their hike when the first wisps of fog slithered between the trees. One moment, the late afternoon sun bathed the forest in golden light. The next, everything was swallowed by a cold, creeping white. "This wasn't in the forecast," Olivia murmured, tightening her jacket around her. Jake glanced at his phone. "No signal. It'll clear up. We just need to stay on the path." They walked on, their boots crunching softly against the damp earth. But with every step, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees, the ground, even the trail itself. It curled around them, dense and unyielding, turning the familiar woods into an endless, shifting void. Jake slowed. "Do you hear that?" Olivia stopped, listened. The usual forest sounds, birds, rustling leaves, distant trickles of water, were gone. The silence was so deep it felt unnatural. Then came the whisper, soft, distant, like someone calling from far away. "Hello?" Olivia called, but the sound barely carried in the thick air. A moment later, the whisper came again. This time, closer. Not a whisper. A breath. Jake grabbed her wrist. "We need to go." They turned, moving quickly, but the trail was gone. Trees had shifted, hadn't they? The fog coiled around the trunks, obscuring their shapes, making everything look the same. Had they turned left or right earlier? Hadn't that fallen log been behind them before? Panic crawled into Olivia's chest. "We're going in circles." Shape moved in the fog. She gasped, clutching Jake's arm. "Did you see that?" He nodded. His fingers were ice cold. "Something's out there." The shape flickered again, just a blur in the mist, too quick, too fluid. It wasn't walking. It was gliding. Another breath. This time, right behind them. Jake turned. Nothing. We have to run. His voice was barely above a whisper. They bolted. The forest blurred, trees twisting in the fog, branches reaching. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, their boots slamming against the unseen path. The whisper followed. Closer now. Too close. Olivia stumbled, catching herself against a tree. Jake grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. "Keep going." The whisper turned into a low hum. A vibration in the air, deep in the bones. The fog pulsed around them, shifting, thickening, alive. Then, through the swirling white, Olivia saw something. A break in the fog. An opening. "There," she gasped. They sprinted toward it. The mist clawed at their ankles, pulling, dragging. The hum grew louder, rising to a deafening pitch, and then they burst through. The fog stopped, just like that. They stood at the edge of the woods, the parking lot in sight, their car right where they left it. Behind them, the fog churned, roiling just beyond the tree line, as if it couldn't cross. They didn't look back, didn't speak. They just got in the car, locked the doors, and drove, leaving the thing in the fog behind. But as they sped away, Olivia realized something. She could still hear it. A whisper, just at the edge of hearing, still calling her name. I've always been one to take long walks in the forest. There's something calming about being surrounded by the trees, the scent of damp earth, and the hush of nature. But this time, things felt different. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest when I stepped into the woods. It started innocently enough. My friend Jack and I decided to take a walk through the forest near our cabin. We'd been here a few times before, but this time, there was a faint, strange hum in the air. It wasn't like the usual rustling of leaves or birds calling out. It was more constant, like a whisper, too soft to catch the words, but it lingered. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper, not wanting to disturb the strange sound. Jack stopped walking, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "The humming, or whispering. It's coming from deeper in the woods." Jack looked at me like I was imagining things. "You're hearing things. It's probably just the wind." But I wasn't convinced. There was something about the sound that unsettled me. It wasn't natural. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching us. We continued down the worn path, the trees closing in around us. The deeper we went, the louder the whispering became, and the heavier the air felt. The woods were thick with shadows, and the forest floor was damp, the earth soft beneath our boots. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be here. I glanced over at Jack. He looked fine, but I could see the unease starting to form in his eyes. We both knew something wasn't right, but neither of us said it aloud. Without warning, the path ahead narrowed, and I saw something strange. The trees ahead were bent in an unnatural way, almost as if they were guiding us into a deeper part of the forest. A part I had never noticed before. "Let's turn back," I said, my voice shaky. "I don't like this. It's too quiet." Jack looked at the strange path ahead, a hesitant expression crossing his face. "We're almost there, right? We'll just keep going a little further." He was right. The path looked like it led to something. Maybe a clearing, maybe not. But the whispering had grown louder now, and it was almost as if the voices were calling our names. I looked around, trying to find some sort of explanation, but there was nothing. Just trees. Tall, dark, and still. We reached the end of the path, and in front of us there was a large stone, weathered by time, covered in moss. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong in the forest. The whispers grew louder now, almost frantic. And then they stopped. For a moment, There was silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, making it hard to breathe. The trees, the wind, everything was still. Even the birds were gone. Jack turned to me, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" Before I could respond, a branch snapped behind us. We both froze, looking over our shoulders. The woods were empty. Nothing but trees and shadows. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure moving between the trees. It was just a silhouette at first, but as it came closer I could make out the shape. A person, but not quite a person. Their limbs were too long, their movements too fluid, like they were drifting through the air instead of walking. Jack grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now." But my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It was getting closer. Too close. The figure stopped just at the edge of the clearing, standing still, staring at us. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The air was thick, heavy, suffocating. The whispering started again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was right in front of us, surrounding us, filling my ears with unintelligible voices. Jack pulled me away, stumbling backward, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It didn't move. It just watched. Finally, Jack managed to pull me into motion, and we ran. We ran back the way we came, but the woods seemed to shift around us, making it harder to find the path. The trees seemed to stretch and grow taller, closing in on us. I kept hearing footsteps behind us, but when I looked, there was nothing. We didn't stop until we were back at the edge of the forest, breathless and trembling. I turned back to look one last time. The figure was gone, but the whispering had stopped too. We didn't talk much as we walked back to the cabin, both of us shaken by what had just happened. The woods felt completely different now, as though we had crossed a boundary, and whatever had been waiting in those trees was still there, watching. We never spoke of the incident again. Every time I walk near that forest, I hear the faintest, a whisper in the wind. But now, I know better than to follow it. It started as a simple evening walk. The trail was well worn, the kind that wound lazily through the dense pines, perfect for a quiet stroll before nightfall. Jake and I had hiked here before, dozens of times in fact. We knew the paths, the landmarks, the little wooden bridge that crossed the narrow stream. There was nothing dangerous about this place, but tonight felt different. The air was heavier than usual, the scent of damp earth and pine needles strangely strong. The trees, tall and motionless, seemed to lean inward as though listening. Even the usual forest sounds, the distant chirping of birds, the rustling of squirrels, were absent. Jake walked ahead of me, whistling an off-key tune, seemingly unbothered. "Feels quiet tonight," he mused, glancing back at me. "Too quiet," I muttered. I wasn't wrong. The silence was unnatural. No wind stirred the branches. The forest floor, covered in fallen leaves, muffled every step we took. Then we heard it. A second pair of footsteps. They weren't loud, just soft, steady crunches on the dirt path behind us. At first, I thought I imagined it, an echo of our own steps. But then we stopped, and the footsteps didn't. Jake turned, frowning. "You hear that?" I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. The trail behind us was empty, just trees and fading light. But the sound had been real. Someone, or something, had been walking when we were, and now it was gone. Jake forced a chuckle. Probably just a deer. I wanted to believe that, but deer don't mimic footsteps. We kept walking, a little faster this time. The sun was setting, and the deeper the forest got, the darker it became. My hands clenched into fists, every instinct screaming that something was off. And then, the Footsteps started again, closer this time. I didn't dare turn around, my breath hitched, heart pounding in my ears. Jake slowed. "Okay, seriously, who's there?" His voice was firm, trying to sound unafraid. No answer, just the stillness of the trees. Then, snap. A twig broke somewhere to our right. Not far, maybe 10 feet. Jake yanked a flashlight from his backpack and aimed it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on nothing but trunks and tangled underbrush. No movement, but something was there, watching. We weren't alone. "We should head back," I whispered. Jake didn't argue. We turned quickly, walking fast, almost jogging now. The parking lot wasn't far, just 15 minutes away. If we moved fast, we could be out before full dark. But the footsteps followed, and they were getting closer. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I grabbed Jake's arm. "Run!" We sprinted. The path blurred beneath us, branches snagging at our clothes as we tore through the trees. The footsteps behind us were louder now, matching our pace stride for stride. It wasn't running after us, it was chasing us. The forest thinned. I spotted the parking lot through the trees, our car, the last one left. And then, the footsteps stopped. Dead silence. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Jake fumbled with the keys, throwing open the doors, and we scrambled inside, locking them instantly. For a long moment, we sat there gasping for breath, staring out into the dark woods. Nothing, just trees. Still, quiet, innocent. Jake exhaled shakily. What the hell was that? I didn't answer, because deep in the trees, just beyond the reach of our headlights, something was standing there, watching. And when we finally drove away, I swear I saw it step onto the path, still following. The woods were always alive. Not in the way humans understood life, no. The trees, the earth, and the creatures that skittered underfoot all had their own rhythms, their own whispers. To the casual hiker, it was an ordinary walk in the forest. A peaceful retreat, a serene stroll beneath towering trees. But the forest? The forest knew better. It waited. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows, Mia and Luke reached the edge of the woods. They had been on the road for hours, seeking adventure, seeking escape. The hum of the city was far behind them, and now, only the rustling of leaves filled the silence. "We'll set up camp here," Luke said, dropping his backpack to the ground. He started unpacking, pulling out a tent and portable stove. His voice calm and steady. Mia hesitated, her gaze shifting uneasily to the towering pines. "Are you sure this is the spot?" Luke shrugged it off. "Perfect place, nice and isolated. We'll be completely alone." But Mia didn't feel alone. The trees felt ancient. Their trunks stretched high, and something about the air felt thick, like the forest was waiting for something. Or someone. Despite her unease, Mia said nothing and helped set up the camp. The evening was calm, though the air seemed heavy with expectation. The fire crackled as Luke fiddled with the stove. Mia glanced nervously at the surrounding woods, the shadows growing deeper with every passing minute. Something wasn't right. "I'm going for a walk," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke didn't look up. "All right, be careful. The woods can mess with your head at night." Mia nodded, even though she wasn't sure if it was her mind or the forest that felt wrong. She walked slowly toward the tree line, drawn to the shadows that seemed to shift and pull at her. The whisper of the wind through the branches sounded, like murmuring voices, but she couldn't make out the words. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. "Come closer." The words were faint, almost imperceptible, like a soft sigh on the wind. Mia took a step forward, her feet carrying her deeper into the woods as though something unseen was urging her. The trees parted as if guiding her path. The whispers grew, louder, more insistent. Come closer. Mia's heart raced. She could feel the forest surrounding her, its eyes on her, its presence overwhelming. The air seemed thicker, colder. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to turn around, but her feet moved of their own accord. Another whisper. Come closer. Closer to what? She didn't know, but something about the sound made her chest tighten with dread. Her eyes darted to the trees. They loomed larger now, their gnarled branches twisting like hands reaching for her. The whispers became a chorus, echoing from every direction. Come closer. Suddenly, she froze. The sound stopped. The wind stilled. The forest was holding its breath. The weight of something unseen pressed against her, pushing her toward the trees, toward the unknown. With a jolt, Mia snapped out of it. She stumbled backward, her legs shaky, and turned toward the clearing. She ran, not daring to look back as the whispers resumed, now mocking, as if the forest knew she would leave. When she burst into the camp, her chest heaving, Luke looked up from the fire. "What's wrong?" Mia didn't answer immediately. She could still hear the whispers in her head, like a lingering echo. She didn't trust herself to speak. "We need to go," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Now!" Luke stared at her, puzzled. "What? Why?" I don't know. The forest. It's not right. We need to leave." Luke stood up, confused, but sensing her urgency. All right, calm down. Let's pack up." But Mia had already grabbed her bag. The forest whispers still echoed in her ears as she turned, not caring if Luke followed. She would leave, even if he didn't. She didn't look back as they made their way toward the road. The air felt less oppressive now, the shadows behind them lighter. The forest had let them go. For now. Mia knew one thing for certain. The woods had been alive, and it had let her leave, but it hadn't forgotten.